Hey, it's been a while. Welcome to the show. So Judaism has always been a religion of compromise. Back when human sacrifice was the norm, we came along and said, yeah, you can make sacrifices in the temple, but it's got to be an animal, never a human being, let alone a child, and you have to share the meat with the poor. Our calendar is lunar-based, with each month corresponding to and named after the new moon, Rosh Chodesh, and that was in the name of reconciliation with the Babylonian moon worshippers. I saw a lot of compromise at the yeshiva I taught at a couple of years ago. One of my students was actually vaping in the hallway and happened to turn around at just the wrong moment, dropping his vape pen right on the principal, who happens to be an Orthodox rabbi and does not mess around. So the kid assumed he was about to be expelled, and you know what the rabbi did? He called in someone else with some expertise on this particular subject and had him as a guest speaker to lecture to the entire school on the dangers of vaping. Now, I didn't catch the lecture myself. Maybe it was super long and boring and kind of meant to be a Full Metal Jacket style of punishment, you know, where one guy messes up and then the entire battalion has to pay for it. But that's also the nature of education. We often learn more from our mistakes than from our successes. And besides, what good would it do to just cast someone out into the cold and lonely darkness of Los Angeles? I mean, it's kind of made me who I am, but that's another can of worms. What also came to my attention is that these discussions the Orthodox are having about vaping are kind of a renewal of the kinds of conversations that were happening in the 1960s as cannabis was blowing up in popularity, even among the observant ones. The consensus was, at least among the wise elders, that cannabis wasn't all that bad, but it is taking the easy way out. Any kind of shortcut is a form of cheating, and it does a disservice to more authentic ways of connecting with Hashem's more mystical characteristics. Every new year is a renewal, and that's probably why it's my favorite of the non-Jewish holidays. Who doesn't like a nice clean slate or a fully completed circle? It doesn't have baggage or controversy like Thanksgiving or Christmas. It's a more universal and secular celebration of rejuvenation and rebirth. The time when the withering decadence of winter begins to make way for fertile ground and a luscious awakening. Darkness gives way to the light. Chaos rules the winter night. Hashem, spare us from your wrath as we tread the sacred path. It's order out of chaos, as is the case in many holy books. Life out of the void, liberation from enslavement, and reconciliation from self-sacrifice. Reminds me of one of my favorite short stories, The Eclipse by Selma Lagerlöf, who was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize for Literature back in 1909, also the first Swedish author to win the award. It's about a group of peasant women in a destitute mountain village, and they don't particularly care for each other, but they're very lonely and need something to gather around. So one of the characters, Beta, realizes that they should get together for the upcoming eclipse. The more she thought about it, the more she felt there was no day in the whole year she would rather celebrate than the one when her friend, the sun, battled against darkness, and, after a glorious conquest, came forth with new splendor and majesty. You see, she said, I haven't any better friend than the sun, and I wanted to give her a party on the day of her eclipse. I felt that we should come together to greet her when she came out of her darkness. Now, they understood what old Beta meant, and their hearts were touched. They began to speak well of the sun. She was kind to the rich and poor alike, and when she came peeping into the hut on a winter's day, she was as comforting as a glowing fire on the hearth. Just the sight of her smiling face made life worth living, whatever the troubles one had to bear. The women went back to their homes after the party, happy and content. They somehow felt richer and more secure in the thought that they had a good, faithful friend in the sun. It's an insightful lesson in the power of personification, But it's also a lot like reading ancient Greek and Roman plays where the sun is synonymous with God. I mean, there is a whole religion based on the worship of the, quote, son of God. I was just going over the differences between homophones, homographs, and homonyms in one of my English classes, and although the two sons didn't come up, it struck me how words really do reveal so much about the human condition, especially with Hebrew words. Case in point, the word for word is devar, which also means thing. That's abracadabra. Literally, I create as I speak. Another example. The Hebrew word for truth, emet, is written, or spelled if you're into magic, in a way that remains solid and consistent. If you type truth into a translation page, you can see the Hebrew letters are quite grounded. There's a real heft to that word. Whereas the word for lie, sheker, is very fragile and uneven because falsehoods lack substance and won't hold up over time. Kind of like a flimsy border wall built by Trump's corrupt campaign donors masquerading as a construction crew. A couple of other sets of homophones that caught my ear were the words not and not, like not going to happen versus tying the knot. And the other is no and no, like no way and oh, I should have known that. In both cases, the insertion of the letter K turns a negative into a positive. The K is a pretty interesting letter. Whereas the X represents the unknown. The K comes from the Greek letter kappa, which itself was derived from the Semitic kaf, a symbol for an open hand. Do you remember Bill Richardson, the governor of New Mexico that ran for president a couple of times? His policy on drugs was just say no. No with a K, which is not only kind of libertarian, but it puts the emphasis on learning. Did I ever tell you about the time I was tempted to file a frivolous lawsuit against a board game company for lying about Moses? It's a trivia game where you get a card with a question and multiple choice answers. One of the questions was, what part of God's body did he reveal to Moses? And the, quote, correct answer, according to this game, was his ass. The game had already proved itself problematic because it had some misinformation about the Peter Pan books. Anyway, it felt like they were making an ass out of all of us, including Moses. So I looked into it. And although it is the rear side of the Almighty that Moses allegedly caught a glimpse of while he was in the cleft of a rock, it's not his rump that stood out. It was the knot, the tzitzit. You know, those kind of cowboy-looking fringes that hang from the Mormon-like magical underwear, which is fascinating on many levels. First, it speaks to our co-partnership with the divine, being created in his image, but also the sacredness of the knot. Weaving is a very mystical practice in Celtic culture and folk magic. You have rope and tying arts like kinbaku and shibari. And of course, the tefillin, which we wrap on ourselves every morning, except Shabbat and high holidays, to remind us that we are bound between the animal world and the spiritual realm. It's got to be made of real leather, again, the carnal nature of man, but it also is a form of acupressure, which might cause an altered state of mind and connects to the more spiritual side. Peos, which are those kind of curly sideburns that the Orthodox often sport, also represent the sacred knot, since they usually get tied behind the ears or at least wrapped, and that's in part to protect your two temples. What's beyond the two temples? The third temple, which must be rebuilt in our lifetime and is considered a spiritual undertaking. We build up the temple with every little thing that we do, because every choice that we make matters. This isn't the time to stand on a pile of ancestral ashes, all of their struggles and sacrifices across oceans and deserts, suffering through droughts and depressions, just so we can stand there and say, maybe later. Speaking of ashes, I'm currently surrounded by 101 fires. The winds have been up to 100 miles an hour, which is even more brutal than when I was in Scotland one winter. So thank goodness we have the Scientologists who are willing to put everything on the line to provide for the community by building something they call a celebrity center. Anyway, these insane winds keep making me feel like I'm in the Jack London story, To Build a Fire, which was semi-autobiographical because he left California for the Yukon when he was only 14. It's really a story about humility and ego. How this guy thinks he can contend with nature? Even the dog character is smarter than the guy. It doesn't know what temperature is, let alone that it's 50 degrees below zero. But at least the dog can sense the danger. We humans often dismiss our own sensibilities and responsibilities. And then what happens? Well, here's my favorite quote from the story. The cold of space smote the unprotected tip of the planet. And he, being on that unprotected tip, received the full force of the blow. And I'm sorry to spoil a story from 123 years ago, but the nameless man in To Build a Fire doesn't make it. He's just a split second too slow with lighting a match. Doesn't help that his fingers are frozen. And when he can't start the fire, he decides to run for it until both of his feet snap off from frostbite. It is hardcore. But the point is that he entertained the concept of meeting death with dignity. There were far worse ways to die. We all have a shelf life. Religions too, which is why it's so important to reconfigure and regroup at least every now and then, to keep things fresh. So have you ever heard of the Jewish renewal movement? Most people just know about Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform. Orthodox attempt to heed exactly to as much of the Torah as possible. Conservative are close to Orthodox, but consider themselves to be a bit more pragmatic with things like being able to drive on Shabbat. And Reform are really the most American of the denominations, in part because they defer back to the congregations in the same way that the U.S. Constitution is frequently deferring back to the states. One way you can tell them apart is that at an Orthodox wedding, the mother of the bride might be pregnant. In a wedding that takes place in a conservative synagogue, the bride might be pregnant. And in a Reform temple, the rabbi might be pregnant. There is a newer branch of Orthodoxy that does allow women to be rabbis. I think they're called the Maharat. And another humorous way of telling Jews apart, the Orthodox believe in a man being the Messiah. The Reform see it as more of a messianic age in which all of humanity is divinely tuned. And the Chabad want the Messiah now! Anyway, within Reform, there's a movement to incorporate more of the majesty and power of Orthodoxy. It was started by Rabbi Zalman, who was originally from Vienna. He lived from 1924 until 2014 and was very interested in a lot of the social changes that were happening in the 1960s. His main goal was to make Jewish mysticism more accessible as well as more inclusive. He spawned several Jewish retreat centers in addition to the Interfaith Eldering Wisdom movement and something called the Human Potential movement, which was a 60s countercultural project claiming that individuals possess a vast, untapped potential for personal growth and self-actualization, and that by actively developing this potential, people can achieve greater happiness, creativity, and fulfillment. It is often incorporated into meditation practices, humanistic psychology, and alternative therapies. There was a series of religious revivals during the colonial period known as the Great Awakening, and it revitalized some of those anti-materialistic views that had been big in the colonies since the Quakers founded Providence as a refuge for religious dissidents. But the best-known revival had to have been the Renaissance, which started in Florence, a city that conceived itself as a new Jerusalem. In fact, the dimensions and proportions of Florence's cathedral were inspired by Solomon's temple. And if you look at artistic renderings of each, you'll notice that they look practically interchangeable. Certain countercultures and subcultures also serve as renewals and revivals of mystical streams of Judaism. I talked a lot in my punk episode about how headbanging is kind of based on shuckling, and mosh pits are really an update of the hora dance. But even the story of Jesus is a renewal of the binding of Isaac. They were both beloved, only sons, offered up willingly for sacrifice by their fathers. In both instances, the offering was on a hilltop, They both had a 3-day journey, and they both carried wood on the way to the sacrifice. And both narratives evoke the kind of unfathomable tension that was exactly what Renaissance artists needed to infuse their work with more psychological depth and emotional currents. And it doesn't matter if you take it as actual history, a first-century mystical parable, or just a fascinating work of literature about a dark-skinned, ethnic minority that was wrongly executed by the state. As are all. What you do to the least among us, you do unto me. There is no need for capital punishment. Some exceptions are, during war and with terrorists. Mussolini, for example, had to be put to death, otherwise his supporters would have broken him out of prison. But life in prison is the more humane as well as fiscally responsible solution. DNA evidence has posthumously exonerated countless individuals, especially in places like Texas. And Jesus was against the death penalty. But you hear very little about that here in our own little medieval times, Jurassic Park, Jungle Book, whatever you want to call it. We're in it. And as long as we're still killing people for killing people to show people that killing people is wrong, that's not going to change. And I'm not talking about abortion. That's something Jesus never spoke of and only comes up in the Bible when God is actually giving Moses abortion tips in the book of Numbers, because sometimes it is necessary to save the life of a mother, which is actually the highest mitzvah one can commit. Pikoa nefesh, to save a life. And according to Exodus, if you accidentally cause a woman to miscarry, it is a much lower fine than if you accidentally kill the mother, acknowledging right there that a fetus or embryo is in no way comparable to a living, breathing person. Don Nigro had an interesting take on Jesus, which was that it works as sort of an artistic coping mechanism. You have to prepare yourself for the fact that your work, even if it is a perfect creation, will eventually be neglected, forgotten, and destroyed. Speaking of destruction, one of the most common arguments against studying the Bible is that it doesn't mention dinosaurs. This is why you might want to take it with a grain of salt anytime someone claims to have some expertise on the subject when they don't even speak Hebrew or Aramaic. When you translate through multiple languages, it's kind of like having too many cooks in the kitchen. Even Michelangelo looked like an ass when he depicted Moses with horns, because the word for shining looks very close to the word for horned in Latin. So if there's a prayer or some text that resonates with you, try and check out a more direct translation or learn a little Hebrew. Could be fun. And I guarantee it'll be a much more powerful, poetic, and enlightening experience. Going all the way back to Genesis, the Hebrew Bible is remarkably accurate for its time. While scientists such as Aristotle were running around claiming that the sun revolved around the earth, Genesis was pointing out that life probably started in the heavens, then the earth, with water animals coming first, then winged animals, then land animals, and so forth. That's exactly what evolution proves. Even if Genesis was written 1,000 years later than originally thought, that's still way ahead of its time. And as far as the dinosaurs go, Genesis 1:21 says that God created the Tenanim Gedolim. Gedolim means big or giant, and Tanim means reptile or dragon. So the next time someone's like, what about the dinosaurs? You can say, oh yeah, the Taninim Gedolim, the giant reptiles from Genesis 1:21. How cool is that? So let's talk about these fires. The Santa Anas have always been problematic, and there have pretty much always been pyromaniacs ready and waiting to exploit the volatility of our terrain. But Iran has been doing a lot of trolling. Things like, this is what you did to Gaza. See how it feels? They didn't seem to care much when Jordan annexed the West Bank, or when Ariel Sharon ripped hundreds of indigenous Jewish families out of their ancestral homes. But I know, this is what we get for being colonizers. I mean, just look at how many countries are being forced to speak Hebrew. Literally 0. I got by just fine in Israel without speaking a single word of Hebrew because it's a multicultural liberal democracy. Compare that to 57 ethno-nationalist Islamic states. And how can we be the colonizers when their temple was built directly on top of ours. You know, Jews are the predominant indigenous people of that land because there are ancient artifacts that Roman, Persian, and other emperors bragged about looting from Israel. You can still see them in museums. And the only reason it was renamed Palestine by the Romans was out of spite. Palestrina was their name for Crete, and since the Jews had an ongoing feud with Crete, kind of like the Hatfields and the McCoys, the Romans destroyed our temple and renamed it after our enemies, just as a final fuck you to the Jews. It would be like if Native Americans had been driven off of their land by invaders who like to call their sports teams things like Braves, Chiefs, and Redskins, right? And the notion of being perpetrators of ethnic cleansing is even more asinine, because even if they are trying to wipe Arabs out of existence in Israel, they're doing a pretty poor job. First of all, there are Arabic Muslims in Israel's government, Supreme Court justices, generals, you name it. Second, if you want to know what ethnic cleansing looks like, see how many Native Americans were wiped out by the Puritans in Massachusetts. It was close to 90% in just a few decades. Yet, the Arabic Palestinian population has more than quintupled since 1948, from 1.4 million to 7.4 million. Explain that! Also, why would Israel go to such great lengths to get more than 1 million doses of the polio vaccine to children in Gaza if they're trying to kill them? Can you give me an example of an Islamic government rushing to inoculate their Jewish population? How is that comparable to colonists giving smallpox-infected blankets to Native Americans? Israel has state-of-the-art hospitals and often provides free medical services to their neighbors. Ironically, several of the people that Hamas murdered on October 7th, including Iri Kassel, volunteered for an Israeli nonprofit that, every year, gave about 1,500 children in Gaza and the West Bank free rides to hospitals in Israel. It was called Road to Recovery and was started in 2010 by Yuval Roth, a peace activist whose brother had been kidnapped and killed nearly 20 years earlier by Hamas militants. The group was founded to help give everyone access to medical treatment in Israel, where health services are considered to be the most advanced in the region, which definitely sounds like apartheid to me. So back to the incineration of Los Angeles. I get this emergency notification that my area is under evacuation warning. And I start looking up the difference between an evacuation order and a warning, figuring out what to pack and which direction to head in. Then I get another notification saying to ignore the previous one. It was sent erroneously, like to all 10 million people in LA. Meanwhile, our mayor was in Ghana for some bizarre reason, right after cutting a bunch of resources and budgets for firefighters. Even Gavin Newsom announced that there's going to be an investigation to see why so many of the hydrants were empty. I have some suspicions, and apparently they have captured one of the arsonists. The guy worked for the UN and had 5 different cell phones on him. But the whole thing felt like equal parts Hawaii back in 2018 when they sent a bogus warning to every single resident of their state about an impending missile attack. And then LA again in 1992 when Mayor Tom Bradley fled the city while the Rodney King verdict was being announced, as if he knew the cops were going to get off and riots were going to break out. Sloppy. Do you remember the mayoral debates from a few years ago? I thought Bass was pathetic when she was asked, on a scale of 1 to 10, how safe she feels walking around in Los Angeles. She said 10! She obviously hadn't even lived here for several years and was totally out of touch with our reality. A lot of these politicians are not really civil servants. They're just opportunists. In fact, I have no memory whatsoever of Kamala Harris being a California senator. She made a big name for herself as AG, but then she was making trips to Iowa before she was even sworn in. You know, Gavin Newsom could have been like that. He was the most popular mayor in America in 2007 after San Francisco got basic universal health coverage. And he probably would have won the Democratic primary the following year if he had run, but he didn't. And he didn't even run for governor in 2010. He kept his cool, held office as lieutenant governor for 8 years, and beat a recall attempt in an off-year election during a pandemic by 67%. That's amazing, and I think he'll be an incredible president in 2029. Those are the kind of public servants I respect. The ones who aren't just jumping from one office to another, but actually seeing the work through. And remember how desperate Harris looked when she was debating Joe Biden in 2019? The whole, "that little girl was me" moment when she tried accusing him of being a racist, that was pro-segregation. It was so rehearsed, it was pandering, and it was inauthentic. And it was appallingly inaccurate. Biden was the one who actually showed up to work in the Senate by train every day while raising 2 boys as a single father. He was fighting the racists and segregationists. And since he introduced the Violence Against Women Act in 1990 and managed to get it passed in 94, rates of domestic violence have decreased by over 50%. Joe was only our second Catholic president, never been divorced. He raised a military hero, Bo, whose rosary beads Joe prays with every single day. He took the train to work every day for 36 years as a senator. And the similarities between Biden and Lyndon Johnson are pretty uncanny. They are the 2 most legislatively prolific presidents in history, despite only being in office for 1 whole term. They both had the humility to resign early, and they were both senators turned vice presidents. In fact, the same way the older, more provincial LBJ helped legitimize the young Bostonian known as JFK, Biden was the boring, old, straight white male that Obama needed to balance out his ticket. The biggest difference probably being that Kennedy really needed LBJ and Texas to win, but after the disaster that was Bush and Cheney, Obama could have won with anyone as his running mate. I mean, Hillary, Mike Gravel, Carrot Top, didn't matter. But in 2020, Biden got 15 million more votes than Obama received 8 years earlier. I don't know if we'll ever see anyone get 81 million votes ever again. Joe was the first president to ever join a picket line, first to enter an active war zone, and he did it twice, Israel and Ukraine. He was the first to end America's longest war, Afghanistan. Even Ann Coulter gave him credit for that one. First to acknowledge the Armenian genocide, first to declare himself a Zionist, first to take on anti-Semitism, even appointing Deborah Lipstadt as a special envoy. First to appoint a Native American cabinet secretary, of the interior no less, and they've given more land back to Native Americans than anyone else in history. The Biden administration has also protected 30% of America's land and water under the America the Beautiful Act, with 264 million acres of public lands already conserved from fracking and mining. He renewed FDR's Buy American Act, which requires virtually everything bought with tax dollars to be made in America. It had gotten as low as about 55% before Biden, in part because the law hadn't been enforced since the Reagan era. He expanded health care to millions of veterans via the PACT Act. He got Mexico to invest $1.5 billion toward a smart wall. He ended the detestable family separation policy, and he cut the child poverty rate in half. No big deal. Biden also made life-saving drugs such as insulin more affordable and forced companies to be more transparent with fees. Don't you hate it when you're spending hours trying to decide what concert to see or which hotel to stay at, and you get to the very end of the process and it's like, there's also a convenience fee and a cleaning fee, so altogether it'll be about triple what you signed up for. So now, corporations can't lie to you about what the final price will be. Imagine that. They really crack down on airlines, too, from junk fees to jerking people around. It's like, enough already. He curtailed our dependence on China with the Chips and Science Act. We're finally making our own computer parts and things like that rather than just importing everything. The infrastructure bill brought the internet to 2.4 million homes that didn't have it during the pandemic. And it's mostly states that voted against him the most: Alaska, Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho. Quite a contrast from the man who punished blue states by doing things like withholding federal fire aid during California's last wildfire outbreak. No, you guys were mean to me. I'm not helping. You should have raked the forests. But hey, just because I've compared Trump to Hitler and the Antichrist doesn't mean he's always wrong. Did you hear that there will be all hell to pay in the Middle East if the hostages are not freed before he's sworn in? He added that those responsible will be hit harder than anybody has been hit in the long and storied history of the United States of America. You know, when the GOP made this New Yorker and lifelong Democrat, at least up until age 65, even Trump's own kids were Democrats, and that's why they couldn't vote for their own father in the primaries in New York. In many ways, it was actually the beginning of a new liberal period. Think about it. He called Bush Jr.'s war with Iraq the greatest foreign policy blunder in history. He rejected Reaganomics and free trade. Remember, it was Reagan that gave amnesty to millions of undocumented workers. The thinking was that governments don't have the right to tell people where they could live or work. Even Cesar Chavez called on Mexico to step up their side of border enforcement because unregulated labor undermines unions. And you don't actually have to be in a union to benefit from these things because unions set the standards for things like mandatory breaks and having to pay overtime. It all eventually just becomes labor law. So you got to think big picture. You had the Gilded Age, which led directly to the labor movement. Then the pendulum swung back toward laissez-faire policies, so much so that the mafia was basically running the country until FDR ended Prohibition and brought on the New Deal, which helped build the most robust middle class in world history. Homes and cars were affordable, college was cheap, if not free, small local businesses were empowered, to the point that you could be dropped randomly into any unknown city in America and still pretty easily figure out where you are just by looking at the names of hotels and restaurants. If you did that now, you wouldn't be able to tell Seattle from Oklahoma City because they all have the same sterile franchises. Monopolization is the exact opposite of free market competition. Even the Eisenhower-Nixon administration was very pro-union and enforced a top tax rate of 93%. In the 80s, of course, Reaganomics took it all away. It takes a long time to feel the economic effects, though, so the nation was on a sugar high for a long time, which is probably part of why 80s music and fashion are so interesting. And it kept going all the way through the neoliberalism of the Clinton and Obama eras. And then Trump came along and talked the talk, but didn't really walk the walk. Biden walked the walk, but didn't talk the talk. And you can't blame the guy. He's got a stutter like Moses, a heavy tongue and heavy lips. But he should have had surrogates, like former Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger talking about all the legislative accomplishments as they were passed. Did you see his video comparing January 6th to Kristallnacht? Nacht? It is the best movie Schwarzenegger has ever made. Anyway, we need more content like that because this isn't the 1970s. Corporate media thrives in a circus and a shit show because competent governance is boring to them. Imagine if Eminem had been to Biden what Kanye was to Trump. I mean, what good did that last-minute endorsement of Kamala do? If he'd been brought into the fold earlier, we probably would have won Michigan. I guess it does give me hope that there seems to be a realignment happening. A lot of people that might have identified as anarchist or communist saw Jewish students being blocked from going to class, which helps absolutely no one. You can cry about divestment all you want, but if you really want to boycott Israel, you probably shouldn't even step foot in a modern hospital, considering how much medicine and medical equipment came from Israel. The ultimate irony perhaps being that kibbutzim are probably communism's greatest success story. They're like communes where everything is shared, even parenting duties. And it's weird to see conservatives so supportive of Israel when that side was traditionally against foreign aid. So, hey, maybe they'll come around on Ukraine too. So a lot of those people that were kind of having a flirtation with the far left have come around and moderated their views. And on the other side, I've heard from a lot of right-leaning people who might have hated Biden in the past, but really admired how much he's fought for us, especially when it comes to standing up to Triple H, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. So let's talk about Jimmy Carter. The guy basically lived through 3 different centuries. He grew up without plumbing, electricity, and when his family finally got a telephone, they had to share the line with several other families. It was such a rural area that his mother happened to be the same nurse that delivered his wife when she was born, Rosalind. He was a humanitarian, a moralist, a farmer and environmentalist, and a nuclear physicist who once lowered himself into a nuclear reactor that was having an active meltdown. But really, the most impressive thing about him was that he was alive for the premiere of all 3 Nosferatu movies. 1929, 1979, and 2024. I know the first one had a European premiere in 1922, but it didn't make it to the States until 7 years later due to a copyright dispute from Bram Stoker's daughter. The first person to smoke weed at the White House allegedly was Willie Nelson on the roof with Chip Carter, Jimmy's son. Snoop Dogg might have been the first to actually smoke inside the White House, though. According to Forbes, Snoop asked to use the bathroom while visiting during Obama's second term, and one of the Secret Service goons was like, "Are you going number 1 or number 2?" And Snoop said 2, just so that he'd have an excuse to light something up. Just to get rid of the smell. And besides the environmentalism, Carter had something in common with Teddy Roosevelt and Joe Biden. They were all too good for the job. Carter did not trust D.C. or the Democratic Party. He brought in his own team from Georgia. They didn't play politics, and in some ways, that's why his presidency was doomed. Teddy cleaned up so much of the corruption in New York that the Republican Party basically made him vice president just to get him out of there. The only reason he took over was that McKinley had been assassinated, and that's why TR is still the youngest president in U.S. history. He didn't run for re-election when he could have, but did end up starting a little something called the Progressive Party. It's more often referred to by its mascot, the bull moose, for some bizarre reason. Probably because it's not often acknowledged that from Lincoln to Roosevelt, the GOP was the left-wing party. Wyoming was even the first state to give women the right to vote in 1869, although technically it was still just a territory at the time. So Colorado likes to brag that they were the first, even though they didn't do it until nearly 3 decades later. Trump also has some shades of Teddy Roosevelt. Besides being 2 of the only 3 presidents from New York, they were both at one time considered to be the most entertaining man in America. Now, Trump may not be tough like Teddy was. He never served in the military, he wears makeup, and he gets spray tans. But I will admit that he's wildly entertaining. So in the spirit of compromise and renewal, I'm going to be taking a step back, getting busier with teaching, which is wonderful, but I'll also be preoccupied with deep cleaning all this ash and debris for the next few months. Also, I have minor surgery coming up. Plus, I haven't even really had a chance to promote this series or see what kind of interfaith networking opportunities are out there because I'm so preoccupied with creating new content. It'll be nice to reset. And in the meantime, please let me know if you happen to have an in somewhere like Free Speech TV or know of any other platforms where a show of this kind might be a good fit. There are videos available on YouTube, and I've never charged for the show, but there is a little Venmo link on the SoundCloud page if you feel like contributing, because I'm working for tips. And I just want to leave you with a few final thoughts, then I'm out, because we only live once. Or do we? They say that the meaning of life is to plant trees under whose shade you do not expect to sit. However, Groucho Marx claimed that the secret of life is honesty and fair dealing. If you can fake that, you've got it made. Another morsel of Jewish wisdom is the Albert Einstein quote that coincidences are God's way of remaining anonymous. According to Sheldon Cooper, if gravity were slightly more powerful, the universe would collapse into a ball. And if gravity were slightly less powerful, the universe would fly apart and there'd be no stars or planets. Gravity is precisely as strong as it needs to be. And if the ratio of the electromagnetic force to the strong force wasn't 1%, life wouldn't exist. What are the odds that would happen all by itself? When Dion Fortune, co-founder of the Fraternity of Inner Light, was asked about the origin of Kabbalah, she said very matter-of-factly, it was a gift. And what a gift to the world it was to learn things like the spherical nature of the universe and the interconnectedness of all being, including the divine, who is but one entity that wears several garments, just as Rashi points out that all of humanity are just different limbs of the same body. And it's not just a Jewish thing, because how do we know who is Jewish and who isn't? Who's going to find out that they're Jewish and who's going to convert? Start asking around. Talk to your friends' grandmas and hear about some of the family origin stories. I've heard some fascinating ones, like a great-grandmother having her life saved by a group of nuns somewhere in Mexico, which is why she converted to Catholicism. But what did she convert from? We may never know. What we do know is that we all share the same light particles, even if you live alone in a hole that you dug in a cave in Alaska. You're never really alone. Even a Vietnamese pig rancher on the other side of the planet is, at least, your 27th cousin. So whatever the next realm is, we have to get through that door together or not at all. If you've seen Boardwalk Empire, then you should know about the parable of the long spoons, where the inhabitants think they're in hell because they can't eat. The spoons they have are too long, and it's torture. But then a breakthrough happens, and they begin feeding each other. It was heaven all along. The parable is attributed to Rabbi Chaim of Ramshishak, and I heard a more recent one where a boy was asking his dad what heaven would be like. He asked, "Is there ice cream in heaven?" And the dad was like, "Yeah." And then the kid's all, "Do they have video games in heaven?" And the dad tells him, "Yeah, they do." So the kid realizes, wow, it sounds a lot like where we already are. There was NASA astronaut Mike Massimino who spent 23 days in space, culminating in an experience where he initially considered that he was seeing Earth from heaven's point of view. But as the planet's beauty revealed itself, he figured out that he had it backwards. This is heaven. This is what it looks like. And another astronaut, Jim Lovell, said that seeing the Earth from space changed him and made him realize that you go to heaven when you're born. It must look like such a beautiful ball of light just floating there, especially surrounded by so much darkness. Which reminds me of what Carl Jung said about the meaning of life. As far as we can discern, the sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light in the darkness of mere being. Do you like it? The question is, will it ever end? Probably in the 7th Hebrew millennium. But we'll be back in some form, I'm sure. What that form will be might depend on you. Kind of like the idea that what you do in this world will determine what form our soul will take in the next life. I used to think that when we dream, we're sort of getting a glimpse of the afterlife. Or is it the before life? Maybe both. But we seem to make many trips back and forth between the realms. Then I find out that there's a Jewish prayer upon waking called the Modeh Ani, and it's just a short, sweet expression of gratitude for our successful return to this world. It's tempting to think that a lot of our best ideas somehow belong to us, but we are products of the natural world, and so are our thoughts. That's part of why Thomas Jefferson didn't believe in copyrights or patents. The light is meant to be spread through stewardship, not ownership. Most spiritual practice involves tuning those channels for more blessings to flow. And that's why Judaism was not only the dawn of monotheism and mindfulness through things like the Modeh Ani and ritual hand-washing. I've said it before that I'm surprised more OCD people don't get into Judea just for the emphasis on hygiene. But you would think more goths would be into it too. After all, you get to wear all black, All of the holidays are sad, and even on your wedding day, which is supposed to be like the happiest day of your life, right? We break glass to remind you of the suffering that came from the destruction of Jerusalem's second temple. But Judea was also striving to create a comprehensive system of ethics. Have you ever benefited from the benefit of the doubt? This Talmudic concept, kaf zechut, which translates as the side of merit, and is the origin of being innocent until proven guilty. Why do you think we call it a judicial system? There's even a little bathroom prayer, which seemed weird to me at first, but again, how amazing is it that thousands of years ago, people were already acknowledging what an intricate anatomical complex we have that somehow works effortlessly. You don't even have to remember to breathe most of the time. It's a miracle that we often take for granted. The concept of an olive branch as a peace offering originates from the first two Hebrew letters, Aleph and Bet, which combined means olive tree. Bet can also be translated as house because they're both wooden, so that's why so many temples have Beth in the name. Obviously, this is where the Greek and English words alphabet come from. The idea of social justice has an origin story within something called tikkun olam, which is Hebrew for repairing the world through things like kindness and compassion. And the more you can better yourself, the more you improve the world around you. As above, so below. Sometimes that kindness and compassion has to be directed at yourself before you can move on to the great work. It's like getting your own oxygen mask on securely before helping everyone else with theirs. It might be hard to forgive yourself. We all have problematic pasts, and every adult is a sort of walking compromise. But as I learned from listening to John Fugelsang talk an Iraq war veteran out of suicide, there are two things that God cannot do. God cannot stop loving you, and God cannot stop forgiving you. I'm all for teaching comparative religion in schools, and everyone should learn about why the birth of monotheism was such a big deal. But why put up 10 commandments in classrooms when there are actually 613 commandments? That's right, 365 don'ts, which correspond to the days of the year, and 248 do's, which reflect the number of bones and major organs in the human body. Pretty cool, huh? So considering what a gifted rabbi Jesus was, why isn't he considered to be the Messiah? Last I checked, there are 3 ways of knowing who the Messiah is. First, he'll instigate a huge renewal and resurgence in Judaism. We're talking standing room only synagogues with lines around the block. Second, there will be a mass migration back to Israel. And third, the third temple will manifest. How many of those requirements did Jesus fulfill? Well, 0 out of 3 ain't bad. But hey, not everyone likes thinking about this stuff, and it's so tempting to take the easy way out. I mean, why rap tefillin every morning when you can just say, hey, I believe in God, so I'm good, right? Can I go back to obsessing over material items now? Catholicism seems to be the one form of Christianity that still has a lot of emphasis on the density and richness of ritual and ceremony. But the dichotomy between Jews and Protestants seems a lot like the duality between theater and film. One is an offshoot of the other, is a lot more accessible with a much wider reach, but is also a more simplified format that lacks a lot of the dimension and intensity of the original. Quakers, aka the Society of Friends, really intrigue me. They're basically the anarchists of Christianity. So if you know someone with a little expertise in that area, or maybe a representative from CLUE, Clergy and Laity United for Economic Justice, or some kind of organization like that would be willing to collaborate on a future episode, drop me a line. CLNKRMR@gmail.com. That handle should work on most social media as well. Because the first thing I do every morning before saying the Modeh Ani and wrapping my tefillin, I check Gmail, Facebook, Blue Sky, Twitter, X, Tumblr, Threads, Telegram, Instagram, Twitch, Discord, Reddit, Quora, CompuServe, Pinterest, Snapchat, WeChat, WhatsApp, Yahoo, Hotmail, eBay, MySpace, Friendster, the AOL buddy list, and then I head on over to LinkedIn.